What is up, guys? Doug Polk here, and today we're going to be looking at a hand from this year's World Series of Poker main event, deep in the event, with James Obst. As we've looked at one before with the straight flush versus quads hand, we're going to take another look at one of the hands he played. On that note, let's go ahead and jump into the flop. The hand doesn't really have much pre-flop action, so we're just going to start there. We'll talk about what happened pre-flop.
Going to see a flop. 10-6 queen, 2 spades. James Obst with a straight flush draw. He checks it.
I would never check a straight flush draw to a man wearing a raccoon hat.
Wynn checks as well. Forecheck Ruzicka with ace-jack checks as well. He's got the best hand right now.
Pre-flop in this hand's a little weird because Wynn decides to open with ace-5 off with what looks to be from middle position. I can't see the exact seat, which should definitely be a fold from that far out. You'd certainly want to raise that on the button or maybe the cutoff if the people behind you were weak, but raising it from mid-position is just too aggressive. Also, I guess there could be some ICM considerations near the bubble, which could make this a little bit better, but being that there are players behind him that have him covered, I don't like this play. Ruzicka decides to flat the button with ace-jack suited, which seems good to me, and Obst decides to flat the big blind with 9-7 of spades, also seems good. The flop comes queen 10-6 with 2 spades, and everyone gets between a little piece to a decent piece. Ace-5, even though he elects to check here, after opening pre-flop, it could be a reasonable bet being that you do have the ace of spades in your hand, which makes bluffing a little bit better. Also, if the turn comes another spade, you can turn your hand into a bluff for all 3 streets representing a flush. So I don't really mind deciding to bet the flop with that hand, but checking is also reasonable, which he decides to do. Now, Ruzicka has a decision on the button between bet and check. I do like check, which is what he does here, because if he bets and gets check raised, he has a very awkward decision with his hand. He also does have a lot of showdown value against both players. If he bets and gets called, he no longer has that showdown value. So I like everyone's play here on the flop, and let's see the turn.
The 5 hits Wynn.
Obst might decide if nobody wants it, I'll take it right here.
Obst with some experience with a straight flush in this main event. Michael Ruan made one against his full house. He bets $1,000,005.
Wynn has put aside his baccarat losing for his biggest poker payday ever.
With bottom pair. And the hat. And a lot of chips. That's a raise to $3.5 million. Ruzicka now with a suited ace-jack and the draw, and he gets out of the way.
This might be the one straight flush draw I might fold. Day 7 main event. Obst down to 16 big blinds. A call here is for nearly 1/3 of his stack.
He puts in $2 million more.
Well, you do have to gamble if you want to win this baby.
The turn comes an offsuit 5, and I think it's important on this board, in Obst's shoes, to decide between bet and check, keeping in mind your stack size. Normally, when you're in the big blind, it checks through and you have a gutter and a flush draw. You're going to want to be betting because you have fold equity by getting your opponents to fold, as well as a lot of equity to improve in the pot. These hands are nice bluffs to be able to get your opponent to fold with a stronger hand in terms of just showdown value. But there is something that we need to think about here. If we decide to bet, what are we going to do if we get raised? It's going to put you in a very awkward situation out of position, and should your opponent raise big enough, you're going to have to fold your hand or commit with your hand. But either way, not a good situation with a suited gut shot. Sorry, with a flush draw gut shot. So this bet, while it would be standard in a lot of situations, I think I would actually prefer to see a check raise all in. That way, if your opponent decides to bet and they are bluffing, you can get them to fold. You don't ever have to fold off your equity. And if the hand just checks through on the turn, you can maybe look to take a stab at it on the river. When you bet here, you're going to put yourself in a very tough position facing a raise, which is what happens when Wynn decides to raise to $3.5 million over this bet. Now again, the sizes in this hand are kind of weird. 1.5 million as the turn bet, I guess, is maybe a little small, but pretty reasonable. This raise to 3.5 million is somewhat baffling. I guess he's really trying to represent pocket 5s, and because he has a 5, it's less likely his opponents can have a set, or a set of 5s rather. At the same time, the button is still left to act and can have a few good hands, like maybe a queen to check the flop back, a bunch of hands with a 10 in them, and occasionally a hand like 6-5 suited or 5-5. And then also the big blind is going to have a wide range of hands that are valuable as well. However, I don't mind occasionally mixing in some bluffs for the hand that do have a 5, because that way when you have a hand like 5-5, you can work in some bluffs. That said, I think I lean more towards not having any hands raised here as the person that opened pre-flop. While you can have a hand like Queen-Queen or maybe a hand like 5-5, you're not going to have those hands very frequently compared to how often you're going to have hands that are weak showdown. For this reason, I think I prefer to call with all of my hands to protect my range with my good hands as well as my weaker hands like Ace-5. I guess the Ace-5 is a bit tough with the button left to act, and I could see either decision, either fold or call, being good. And if you want to have a raise strategy, I could also see that being okay too. So I guess there's a lot of options here. My biggest problem is the size he elects to raise. By going 3.5 million, Obst really can't fold unless he has specifically a gut shot or maybe a really weak open-ender. Otherwise, he's going to have to call because his odds are just too good. He's calling 2 million to win a pot that will be 10 million. He only needs 20% equity to have enough equity to call, which is going to be any flush draw or straight open-ender with, some good high card potential to either hit the draw or pair up. So I don't really like the size, and the other problem, I guess, is if he goes too much bigger, he's going to commit himself against the big blind. So I think overall, he should just not have a raise range here, and he should either be calling or folding. Ruzicka has an easy fold once it goes bet raise, and now it's back to Obst. I think he has a legitimately tough decision here. I could see both jamming and calling being good. If you jam, you can have some 2-pair type hands and work those in for value. And you can also work in some bluffs with hands like 9-7 of spades or other suited connected type hands. That said, you shouldn't really have many of those holdings because I think they should lean towards check raise all in. But you could definitely make that move with a hand like the nut flush draw or maybe a hand like King-9 of spades. One of those types of hands would make a lot of sense to mix in as a bluff as well. Anyway, he decides to call, which is definitely plus EV, and I don't mind mainly calling here with my range in the big blind, looking to play some rivers. Let's see what the river is.
The river card. The 5 of spades, and Obst rivers his flush, not a straight flush. Win with trip 5s.
Well, the gamble pays off. Obst should have at least 30 bigs at the end of this action.
Obst checks it over to win.
And Queen definitely will bet here. Trip 5s feels like a monster the way this hand played.
We win with almost enough to put Obst all in, 4 million.
Actually, originally I thought Obst might shove. Then I figured he was looking to check raise all in, but he hasn't insta-called. Does he really think Wynn rivered a monster? It is effectively for his main event, and we did see him make a huge hero fold with his full house against Micro Oran straight flush.
Win with trip 5s, Obst with the flush, 9 high flush.
Now the repeat, not a good sign. Obst not oozing confidence here.
A fold means Obst is the short stack with just 4.5 million, and that's what happens.
The river is Action City. Obst improves to a flush on the 5 of spades, and Wynn improves to 3 of a kind. 3 of a kind is almost always going to be good here if you're in Wynn's shoes, because if your opponent has a hand like 2-pair, they might be jamming the turn. If they have a hand like a flush draw, they might be jamming the turn as well. And so really there's only a few flushes you lose to, but mainly you're going to be up against a hand like a queen or maybe a good 10, but probably primarily a hand like a queen. Also, the 5 counterfeits to pair type hands, not that it matters because trips would beat those hands anyway, but overall Obst's range has gotten substantially weaker, and it's important for him to factor that in. In Obst's shoes, you're going to have to call it off on the river here with some queens because your range simply does not have enough hands that are better than a queen to call all in. A flush isn't even in the ballpark of hands that you can begin to consider folding, even though I'm probably going to get insulted again like on the last fold video, or the last video I said you should just call it off or jam your hand. A flush is far too good given how many hands you can have here and what kinds of hands you can have here. You could have a hand like King Jack or Jack 9 or just a queen. A queen should generally be betting here on the turn. A flush is far too strong, and in fact it's so strong that your opponent can actually think that certain hands are value bets that don't even beat your hand. Generally speaking, when you have a hand strong enough where your opponent could try and value bet a worse hand than you hold, you want to stay away from folding, because not only do you win if your opponent decides to bluff, You also win if you beat some of their value holdings. So when you have hands that are in your top 10 to 15% of all the hands you can have, combined with your opponent thinks your hand looks a lot worse, you're going to have to call it off with these hands basically always. I think the real question in this hand is what would we do here when we have a queen? I think the answer is call with some of them, maybe call with the stronger queens, and let the weaker queens go. If you always called all your queens, or you always fold all your queens, you would be very exploitable in this position. If you always folded, you'd probably fold like 70% of your hands, so you can't always fold a queen, it's simply too strong. And if you always called, you would only be folding about 20 or 30% of your hands. So you might need to call about half your queens, fold about half your queens, fold your misdraws, and obviously call anything stronger than a queen because of how high up in your range it is.
Wow. Qui Win will take that pot. Win moves up a notch on the leaderboard. Obst nursing the short stack right now in the room.
All right, thank you for joining me here today for Poker Hands. I thought this was an interesting hand. And guys, don't be afraid to put in your chips with a good hand and sometimes get shown the nuts. Thank you for joining me for Poker Hands. If you like content like this, click that subscribe button. We have many more Poker Hands episodes coming up, and get ready to learn.